Hello, in this video we're going to be talking about the tissues within a plant, so let's not waste any of your time. Let's get right to it. Now, when we're talking about plants, the first thing we want to remind ourselves of is the three types of tissues, and this is the diagram that we saw in the last video, but I brought it in here as a start. Remember, dermal tissue is the outermost tissue layer. Vascular tissue is the tissue that transports the needed materials around the plant, whether it's from the ground as in water up or the sugars photosynthesis down. And of course, ground tissue is the kind of the meaty part of a plant. If you think about a tree that's been cut down but you still have the stump and you're looking down onto it, the vascular tissue would be a very, very small circle in the middle, and then the ground tissue would be everything from that small circle out to the edge, to where the epidermis is. So the ground tissue is a majority by far, possibly over 90% of the plant. But each of those have their own slides. Let's get to those. Now, when we're thinking dermal tissue, obviously we're thinking the outermost edge. Now on us, the outermost edge is just the outside of this, where the skin is. But if you think about a plant, especially if it's a leaf, you got to think on top and on bottom. Just like if you were laying on the floor, you're face down or face up, whichever you were. The top part would be the epidermis, as well as the bottom part. Now for us, this skin is the same wherever you'd be, but for the epidermis, for the dermal layer, it would be different on a plant as far as what's going on. The top part, especially if you're thinking of a leaf, that would be the dermal, that would be the epidermis. Okay, and if it's a waxy coat on the plant, then that's where the cuticle would be. And then, but on the underneath, when we get to stomata, talking about stomata, we'll break this down more. But the underneath of a leaf is where the stomatas are located. So the top of a leaf and the bottom of the leaf would not be identical. It would be different, and those stomatas are there to avoid as much heat from the sun and evaporation or transpiration, water loss. So you've got that upper part, the dermal, but inside of that, those mesophyll sections, you can see the bracket to the right of the picture below me. That's where the ground tissue is going to be, and you can see what a big portion of that is. We're going to talk ground tissue here in a little bit, but that's where the photosynthesis occurs, and the parenchyma cells. So dermal tissue, that very top and the very bottom, and then the ground tissue that you can see there, and in that really small circle, kind of not quite in the middle of that diagram, but to a little bit of the left, you can see where that vascular tissue is, the zoom and the xylem and phloem, that small circle in the middle. Okay, talking about vascular tissue. Vascular tissue is very important, just like your blood vessels, arteries, and capillaries would be important to you. But the vascular tissue is what moves the materials around, the resources around the plant. If it is water, like if it's water in the ground, it's going to pull that up with a kind of a vacuum type process. When the stomatas are open, It's kind of like a wind tunnel to think of it that way, but it allows pressures to increase to get that water up throughout the plant. Because if you think about it, you got a 200-foot tree or a 100-foot tree, even a typical backyard tree that's 50, 60 feet tall. I mean, that's a long way to move water without any real pump. I mean, we in our bodies, we have our heart that beats, that pumps that blood around. But trees don't have anything like that. They've got to rely on that vacuum, that capillary action, the adhesion, kind of cohesion processes that we talked about way back in what would that be? Chapter 3, the macromolecules, or is that 4? No, it'd be 3, macromolecules, the water section there at the end of properties of water. But you can see they kind of work let's see, the process of the work. I mean, the green xylem, moving up, just kind of a hollow tube kind of thing, but the phloem has perforated sections to kind of keep that materials moving through at a good rate. The idea of moving sugars throughout the plant. I mean, the photosynthesis processes on leaves, and if it's a green plant, the stems as well, making those sugars. But then you got to get them moved around to the rest of the plant. You just got to remember that, like we talked about in the last video, or at least we showed it. Photosynthesis obviously occurs in plants, but so does cellular respiration. It's the idea of the plants make those sugars, but they don't make them for the herbivores. They make them for themselves. Herbivores just come along and tap into the system. So there's still cellular respiration going on, and the idea of vascular tissue. Now, when we're thinking xylem tissues, it's got 3 types. You can see that's parenchyma. We've mentioned that ground tissue is the site for most photosynthesis, but we haven't got to cells yet. But the parenchyma cells are the cells that get the photosynthesis process done. They're the ones that have the chloroplast. But there are xylem parenchyma cells. So obviously not in the roots, but in the rest of the plant, as in those xylem cells that are parenchyma, photosynthesis is going to be going on. But there's tracheids, which you can see are kind of modified. They're pretty thick cell walls, just pretty durable process. And then you got your vessel elements that are thinner, shorter, or thinner walls, and they're shorter, but they're all part of the process of helping move water from the ground up through the rest of the plant. Okay, and we're thinking about vascular tissue, thinking about the phloem. It also has 3 types. It's got sieve tubes, which we looked at on the last screen, those perforated, and it's got the companion cells, and it's also got parenchyma cells as well, and then fibers that kind of connect those two for a supporting process. Now, the ground tissue, we've mentioned a couple times about this, and you can see what I've been referring to as a majority of the inside of a plant. You got that vascular tissue right in the middle, the xylem and phloem that we just talked about, the epidermis on the very edge, the dermal tissue, and then that ground tissue. So again, going back to my arm or leg metaphor for ground tissue, if you can imagine a ham, we've all seen a ham that's been sliced in half, and you got that big meaty part, maybe the bone right in the middle, and then of course the cured edge, the darkened edge has been cooked. But that's the idea of the ground tissue. So the ground tissue we talked about in the earlier slide in this video, that's the mesophyll section of the tissue. You've got the epidermis and the waxy cuticle on the top, and you got the stomata underneath. Then you got that big mesophyll section in the middle there, with the vascular bundle kind of in the center of all that. But this is the site. These are the cell or the tissue that has a majority of the photosynthesis going on. We just talked about xylem having some parenchyma cells and phloem having some parenchyma cells, but the majority of the photosynthetic stuff that occurs happens in the ground tissue. Well, that's our video over the tissues of a plant. When we come back together next time, we're going to be talking about the parts of a plant. We'll see you then.